Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Regina Hill, and I'm so delighted to welcome you to the second of 3 lectures on the subject, Addressing the Soul Sickness of Racism, sponsored by the Center for Spirituality and the Division for Inclusion and Equity. Founded in 1984 with generous support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross, the Center for Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. A hub for scholarly and public engagement, we draw on intellectual resources in the Catholic and Christian heritage, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. In 2021, the Division for Inclusion and Equity was founded as an institutional response to achieve inclusive excellence across St. Mary's and to address the growing needs of our changing campus community. This division serves as an essential resource in furthering the college's commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, while fostering a learning environment for all members to succeed in an increasing diverse and global society. Before we proceed with our exciting event, I cannot wait to hear Dr. Horan. We wish to acknowledge that St. Mary's College is located on sacred land. We honor the Native peoples we honor the Native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. We particularly recognize the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi and Miami, who have cared for this land and its resources for many generations and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we recognize these Native people and their cultures within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. For those of you joining us via webinar live stream, please feel free to post your questions or comments using either the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window or insert them in the chat. And now it is my privilege to welcome our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Dan Horan. He is a professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology, and the director of the Center for Spirituality here at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. A columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, he is the author of more than 14 books. When do you have time to do everything else? Including Catholicity and Emerging Personhood, a contemporary theological anthropology, which received the 2020 First Place Award for a theology book from the Association of Catholic Publishers. Congratulations. And his 2 most recent books are titled A White Catholic's Guide to Racism and Privilege and The Way of the Franciscan, a Prayer Journey Through Lent. A specialist in systemic theology, medieval philosophy, and the history of spirituality, that just means he's smart. He is currently working on a Christology book about the divine reason for the incarnation and a book about the anti-racist and nonviolent spirituality of the monk and author Thomas Merton. Professor Horan regularly lectures across the United States and abroad. He serves on several boards, and he serves as the co-host of the Francis Effect podcast. Please welcome the busiest man in town, this side of the Mississippi River, Dr. Dan Horan.
When it comes to being busy, the old expression, it takes one to know one, feels apt here. Thank you, Dr. Hill. Thank you to those who are gathered physically in this space and to our friends who are joining us via the webinar through live stream. It's a real delight to be with you. In recent weeks, we have seen newly elected Virginia Governor Glenn Youngstown issue an executive order on his first day in office that forbids the teaching of, quote, inherently divisive concepts, including critical race theory, in schools. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis is pushing a bill that, quote, would prohibit Florida's public schools and private businesses from making people feel discomfort or guilt based on their race, sex, or national origin, and which is now making its way through the state legislature. And here in our own state of Indiana, House Bill 1134 seeks to impose a similar moratorium on discussions of any historical facts that may cause racial discomfort or guilt in Hoosier schools. As Dr. Drew Pierce, my colleague in the philosophy department here at St. Mary's, recently wrote in an Indy Star op-ed, while white guilt is not a particularly productive emotion, good teachers know that learning and growth often entails some level of discomfort. But the ultimate goal of bills like HB 1134 is not only to prevent white discomfort, it is to preserve and protect white ignorance, end quote. Virginia, Florida, and Indiana are not the only places seeking to pass such legislation. As of this week, there are 30 states with similar bills on the books, most of which are modeled on former President Trump's September 2020 executive order, which curbed the ability of government offices and contractors to engage in DEI, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion training and discussions, citing race and sex stereotyping as the predominant concern. What was really motivating the executive action, though, was a desire to dampen or silence genuine truth-telling, historical analysis, and engagement with the complexity of our collective and individual pasts and contexts, which includes the persistence of systemic racism in a society that views whiteness as supreme. The crusades against anti-racist pedagogy, resources, and knowledge more broadly has nothing to do with education, as Dr. Pierce keenly noted. It has everything to do with politics. He explains in his op-ed that these political efforts are aimed at, quote, shaping a generation of students to remain in the dark about our country's our country's legacy, of racial injustice, and thus remain amenable to the GOP's racially regressive platform, end quote. Now, President Joe Biden rescinded Trump's executive order on January 20th, 2021, which happened to be President Biden's first day in office. However, the template was already cast, and state and local governments have seized the opportunity to carry forward the baton of legally protected white comfort and supremacy. Recourse to the legal system is not a new tactic for the social, economic, and political bolstering of white people in the United States. Beginning with the oppression and genocide of Native North American peoples and the introduction of chattel slavery in the 17th century, up and through the Jim Crow era, explicit legal privileges and protections were granted to those who were identified as white in America. From the mid-20th century onward, due to signature Supreme Court decisions, it was no longer acceptable, or technically speaking, legal, to enshrine anti-Black racist laws at the local, state, and federal levels. Therefore, as philosopher Shannon Sullivan explains, when it became illegal to grant social, educational, financial, and other advantages to white people's racial advantages became more difficult to identify. Many white people thought that perhaps those advantages really had been eliminated and the new laws were working to ensure equal opportunity no matter what one's race, end quote. However, as scholars, activists, and ordinary citizens alike have observed, there continues to exist a major disparity between the way that those identified as white are viewed and treated and protected in the United States when compared with Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. This phenomenon is what has been traditionally described as white privilege. In short, to borrow a definition from the anti-racist educator Francis Kendall, white privilege is an institutional rather than personal set of benefits granted to those of us who, by race, resemble the people who hold power positions in our institutions. One of the primary privileges is having greater access to power and resources than people of color do. In other words, purely on the basis of our skin color, doors are open to us that are not open to other people. Now, I recognize that the term white privilege has become problematic in different circles and for different reasons. Among those who wish to deny the reality altogether, those predominantly white populations of people who refuse to accept their own racialization and the consequences, and indeed benefits, of being identified as white in a systematically racist society, their objection tends to rest with the premise itself. There is a refusal they have to accept that certain benefits, advantages, or privileges, or privileged treatments are bestowed upon them, both historically and concurrently, on account of their racial identity. Such folks, though not universally, are often those inclined to decry so-called reverse racism or rally against institutional and policy correctives such as affirmative action on account that overt legal structures maintaining the supremacy of whiteness in this country have been overturned. And we can think of things like court decisions like Brown versus Board of Education or the passage of the Civil Rights Act and so forth. Such folks commonly, if inaccurately, describe our society and institutions as post-racist and frequently claim that any effort to dismantle or correct for systemic racism is an affront to their own opportunities or freedoms. And yet there are still others, including some scholars and anti-racist activists, who have also raised questions about white privilege as a useful term. In this group, nobody denies the phenomenon and the real-life manifestations that white privilege seeks to describe. However, recognizing the complexity of intersecting identities and constantly shifting social locations, particularly when one considers other factors in one's identity like gender, class, sexual orientation, nation of origin, physical and mental ability, and the like, they've put their focus on whether privilege as the operative descriptor is ultimately helpful or not. Poor whites, for example, struggle to accept the reality of racial privilege when economic and social oppression is a real force in their experience, even if they might benefit from being identified as white in a systematically racist society. One can likewise imagine the kind of defensive postures adopted by white transgender persons or white disabled persons, and so on. Recent work like that of philosopher Shannon Sullivan on what she calls white priority, or even my own modest proposal of the snowplow metaphor published in my column yesterday in NCR, are attempts to introduce nomenclature that gets at the heart of the phenomenon while recognizing the manifold conceptual hurdles that privilege, the term privilege, can introduce in some conversations. Whatever we end up calling the other side of the coin of systemic racism, we are witnessing a fierce backlash from white people today, especially white people with political power, to the growing social awareness and the reality of racial injustice in this country. Many white people cannot stand to reckon with the truth that such injustice has and continues to exist, and that the history, perception, and memory of the world as they may recount it, in many ways is false. This visceral reaction, ranging from what sociologist Robin DiAngelo calls white fragility to what historian Carol Anderson names white rage, is fueling the push among white legislatures to once again codify the supremacy of whiteness into American law. The tenor of the proposed legislation across the country is one of censure, silence, erasure, and denial. It's a refusal to accept history. It is a rejection of reality. And it has one purpose: to shield white people, especially white students, from facing difficult truths about their own whiteness and the impacts of whiteness on themselves and others. So in the time that remains that I have, I want to look at what is being denied here, namely the meaning of whiteness and its impacts. And I will do this in 3 parts with what I hope is still plenty of time for some discussion. First, I want to talk about what it means to be white. Next, I will highlight some of the impacts of whiteness in our society. And finally, I wish to identify a few suggestions for white folks like me moving forward. First, what does it mean to be white? Learning about whiteness can be a startling reality for many white people because we white people in the United States have been generally raised, socialized, taught, entertained, and informed by a system that casts doubt on the existence of whiteness as a racial category, and in the rare instance in which whiteness is acknowledged, denies it has any meaningful consequence. To learn about our assumed racial identity when so much effort and energy has gone into denying it, ignoring it, or explaining it away is to risk encountering the manifold falsehoods that whites have taken for granted as truth. It means risking the discomfort of knowing what has been invisible to us, but plain to people of color, and to risk having to relearn a fair amount about reality and forego faulty assumptions about who we are and how we are in the world marred by inescapable racism and white supremacy. We white people are, at least at first, unreliable narrators about race. I think we need to name that from the outset. I certainly can speak for myself. However, women and men and our other siblings of color have long attested to the painful truths of racism and privilege in a white supremacist culture and narrated accurately those basic aspects of what it means to be white within such a context. They can do this because their experience at nearly every point of navigating life in a pervasively racist society is an experience of encountering subjugation, minimization, dismissal, and rejection, all against the contrast of whiteness presented as normative, which people of color have never had the privilege to overlook or ignore. When scholars and activists talk about the United States being a white supremacist nation, this is at the heart of that forceful yet true summation. Though many people assume white supremacist is a term reserved only for those who avowedly embrace the belief of white racial superiority, like racism in general, the term white supremacy is really far more nuanced. So while we usually associate white supremacy with self-avowed members of the KKK and neo-Nazi groups and other such hate groups that the Southern Poverty Law Center, you can go on their website, I highly recommend that, and look at the maps of groups where people are unapologetically white supremacists, embracing that ideology. There's another way to think about it more complexly. Because the American cultural context is one in which whiteness is presumed to be the default in all aspects of life, our society then is rightly described as one that elevates those people and things associated with whiteness while subordinating or denigrating those people or things associated with any other racial identity. I have learned and been challenged by the insightful work of many people of color who are far more reliable narrators about whiteness than even the most self-critically aware white person. And I continue to learn and be humbled by my own ignorance and deeply ingrained racism. This includes those who are self-critically aware, anti-racist white folks. I'd like to consider myself in that camp, but I realize how deeply ingrained white supremacy and systemic racism is and I'll say more about this in my own case, in our culture. But I wanted to take this opportunity, speaking of reliable narrators, to do a shout out to a very talented poet and playwright named Claudia Rankine, who is a Yale professor of law and a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient. I think that's what it's called, right? MacArthur Genius. A few years ago, she published a play called The White Card that was performed in 2018. This version of the publication came out in 2019, and I highly, highly recommend folks check it out. It's a very engrossing and captivating read. I have no direct connections here to the drama department or the arts department at St. Mary's, but I would highly encourage the tri-campus area to think about putting on this show. But it really unveils the deeply ingrained white supremacy that exists even in the experience of those who identify as anti-racist white folks. I might share a little bit more from Claudia Rankine if I have time in a moment. To put it bluntly, though, most white people in the United States do not know who we are because, as the writer James Baldwin observed, whites live a lie of their own creation and support the perpetuation of the lie of neutrality, normalcy, and supremacy by means of opposition and othering. In other words, white identity is often framed as, I am not X or I am not Y, and so on. According to this formulation, to ask, what does it mean to be white, leads to the inevitable, if oftentimes unspoken response, it means to be not Black. This is an instance of what scholars call social binaries, where individuals and groups form identities over, against, and in opposition to another group that is typically viewed by the dominant group to be lesser than and inferior. This sort of dynamic is not limited to race as the only determining category. This happens in lots of other ways. It'd be remiss of me not to acknowledge here at a women's college the reality of sexism and how gender is oftentimes deployed in this way, right? A hierarchy of othering. But it applies across the board whenever systemic oppression kind of rears its ugly head. And we can think of all the various iterations. I mentioned sexism, but we can think of all the various other isms, right, as it's often said. As the legal scholar Harlan Dalton has summarized, race exists only in relation to one another. Whiteness is meaningless in the absence of Blackness. The same holds in reverse. Moreover, race itself would be meaningless if it were not a fault line along which power, prestige, and respect are distributed. On this last point, it's worth noting that race is about meaning making in the American context. It is, on the one hand, an arbitrary system of valuation tied to appearances, perceptions, and external categories. This is what we mean when we say that race is a social construction. However, that the system is arbitrary That is, it doesn't have any objective grounding in science or anything else outside of particular social contexts, does not mean that race is unimportant or irrelevant. On the contrary, because we live in a society that places an immense amount of significance on race, it is extremely consequential for both the beneficiaries, that is, whites, and those who are harmed or disadvantaged by the same system, that is, Blacks and other people of color. Let me just give a shout out to the tech folks. If you, on the left-hand side, turn it off and on. Okay, sorry folks at home. We're still learning the tech stuff here. Skeleton crew of great volunteers. Hopefully that, I'm assuming, okay, good. I'm assuming that the camera went out. Good, because I don't want you to miss this quote. As the philosopher Charles Mills explains, this racial dichotomization was not incidental. It was not just that the rulers happened to be white and the subjugated happened to be non-white. Rather, race was absolutely central to the justificatory ideology of the period, and he's referring here to the 18th through 20th centuries. It was precisely because of alleged white superiority to other races that whites saw themselves as entitled to rule over them. The meaning assigned to skin color or phenotype arose from a system of power, shaped in particular by the European colonization of what is today North America, beginning with the dislocation and genocide of the indigenous peoples of this land, and then the emergence of the Atlantic slave trade. Just as the meaning of Blackness, or more bluntly, non-whiteness, developed and shifted in accordance with the historical circumstances of oppression and white supremacy over the last 4 centuries, so too did the meaning of whiteness, even if it was neither easily or deliberately recognized. As sociologist Teresa Guess explains, social actors were involved in constructing laws, rules, and regulations that created structural social relations during slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and the civil rights eras. Both Black and white people, both enslaved and free people, understood the racial rules that ordered their day-to-day routines in everyday life. Across time and space, racial routines and social interaction became institutionalized practices that ensured social distance and geographic separation between Black and white population groups. Race is, as the renowned historian Nell Irvin Painter plainly states, an idea, not a fact. And its questions demand answers from the conceptual rather than the factual realm. To begin to understand what race is, one has to grapple with the history of a concept, of an idea, and reckon with its fluidity. Painter explains constructions of whiteness have changed over time, shifting to accommodate the demands of social change. And those of you familiar with US history will know that various groups of European immigrants, including the Irish, Italians, Jews from Eastern Europe, and so on, were considered as embodying various degrees of whiteness, and in some cases, none at all for a period of time, which established a hierarchical casting of those who might today comfortably identify or be categorized as white. In other words, there has always been a shifting sense to the meaning of what race highlights, and it shows to us, it reveals to us what we mean when we talk about it as a social construct. It is something not determined by objective fact or by science or by anything that can be measured other than social declaration. Whiteness is one among many socially constructed races in our American context. But for most of us white folks, we have been conditioned to view ourselves as non-racialized and therefore, quote, normal, natural, and default when viewing ourselves in relationship to others who are not white. Realizing the truth about the arbitrariness of racial classification and its lack of biological grounding helps us to see the world with greater clarity and awareness. If we white people allow ourselves to continue learning over time, perhaps our awareness of the meaning applied to and the consequences arising from racial categorization will increase, and our ability to recognize the two-sided coin of racial injustice and privilege will improve. That's the hope. And I have to interject here as well, and that's the contrary aim of those legislative propositions, to not engage with those realities or to actually not improve in that awareness. So what follows then in my remaining time is the possibility of seeing some of those impacts of whiteness. What are those for both those of us who are identified as white and those who are not within our society? So some impacts of whiteness. In looking at some of the many impacts of whiteness in our society, I want to highlight just a few, namely whiteness as normative, whiteness as invisible, and whiteness as property. All three of these examples offer a glimpse into the concurrent yet divergent impacts of white people and people of color. So first, whiteness as normative. Because we live in a society in which whiteness, both phenotypically, that is how people's appearance seems to others, or we could say our skin color, and culturally, whiteness understood as more than just the color of one's skin. Because whiteness in our society is considered supreme, that is the default or normal or ideal, we can say that those who are identified as white and that which is understood to be related to white culture or identity is considered then to be normative or the standard. The dynamics are binary in that oppositional identity formation arises from society assigning meaning or value to characteristics of a given racialized group. When whiteness is understood as normative or ideal, or held as supreme, this does not merely mean that there is an equal difference applied to each racialized group, as if there were a binary but positively complementary set of meanings. Instead, as with all else in the two-sided coin of racial injustice, one categorization is valued positively or desirable, while the other is valued negatively or understood to be undesirable. And we see this play out in several ways when whiteness is the positively valued racial category. So here are a few examples. Being identified as white means never having to think about one's racialized identity or self as part of a racial grouping. Conversely, being Black in the same context means being hyper-vigilant about real and perceived dynamics of whiteness in order to negotiate social settings, and sadly is also often a requirement for survival. Being identified as white means being the beneficiaries of a society that prioritizes one's comfort in a wide variety of contexts, especially when difficult topics inducing racial stress are induced. Again, see Exhibit A of those legal proposals. Conversely, being Black in the same context often means having one's feelings, history, and experience dismissed, denied, or erased, while never having one's comfort given social priority. Being identified as white means almost always fitting in and having a sense of unearned belonging or entitlement to spaces and places. Conversely, being Black in the same context often means experiencing a palpable sense of alterity and difference while being perceived as a perennial outsider or other. Being identified as white means one's experience is the presumed baseline for normalcy, acceptability, and propriety. Conversely, being Black in the same context means frequently experiencing the devaluation of cultural and historical heritage, art, and aesthetic preferences, and fashion and style choices, among others. Being identified as white means benefiting from widespread social presumptions of goodness, trustworthiness, and competence. Conversely, and disturbingly, being Black in the same context regularly results in unfounded presumptions of criminality or being perceived with suspicion. And if you have any doubts about that reality, I direct your attention to all the unarmed murders of people of color by law enforcement in this country. When we talk about a systematically racist or white supremacist society, we are always already talking about a setting in which whiteness goes unquestioned as ideal, with the tragic consequence that otherness is always positioned oppositionally and negatively. Next, whiteness as invisible. White women and men like me do not generally talk about whiteness because the dynamics that make possible the burdening and oppression of persons of color also simultaneously covers over the reality of whiteness as a racial marker within the web of relations in which we find ourselves. I would, if there were more people here, I know we have a good crowd on our webinar, and I don't want to put the faithful remnant in the room on the spot, but I would imagine if I were to ask virtually in reality, how many of the folks who are identified as white with us today live have had conversations about whiteness in their family or friend group or in predominantly white contexts, I'd imagine very few hands would be raised. Philosopher Sarah Ahmed highlights that whites do not generally recognize whiteness because they are socialized to believe that their identities, perspectives, and cultures are simply the norm or default, that is, the way things ought to be. She writes, "It has become commonplace for whiteness to be represented as invisible, as the unseen or the unmarked, as the non-color, the absent presence, or the hidden referent against which all other colors are measured as forms of deviance," end quote. As the theorist George Lipschitz explains, whiteness is everywhere in US culture, but it is very hard to see. As the unmarked category against which difference is constructed, whiteness has never has to speak its name, never has to acknowledge its rule as an organizing principle in social and cultural relations, end quote. I'm reminded here too of the author and anti-racist activist, Ijoma Oluo, who in an article she wrote on the blog Medium some years ago, many years ago now, and I'm going to paraphrase this because it's off the top of my head, made a remark about how white people have never needed to acknowledge or learn about their own whiteness because they've never needed it to survive. And she, as a person of color, said, I need to know everything about what is unspoken in your own context. To sum up the blindness to the reality of whiteness as experienced by most white people, philosopher George Yancey explains, the fact of the matter is that for white people, whiteness is the transcendental norm in terms of which they live their lives as persons, individuals. People of color, however, confront whiteness in their everyday lives not as an abstract concept, but in the form of embodied whites who engage in racist practices that negatively affect their lives. Black people and people of color thus strive to disarticulate the link between whiteness and the assumption of just being human in order to create what he, as a philosopher, calls a critical slippage, what we, maybe more commonplace, would call just a way to live. Elsewhere, Professor Yancey likens the socialization of whites into whiteness to the manner in which native English speakers learn English growing up. And I'll confess to you all, when I first read his essay about this years ago, it was eye-opening because it is kind of mysterious, right? Those of us who know more than one language have very clear memories, unless we learned from childhood onward, of how we learned and how difficult it is. But do you have any memories of what it's like to learn your native language, your first language? He uses English as the first language as an example, and he writes, one learns English in the context of the everyday by hearing it spoken. The subject of the language learning process does not self-consciously incorporate the grammar of English. Yet parents engage in correcting the linguistic performances of their children. This is part of what it means to inhabit a linguistic community. In other words, when you were, 9 months old, 1 year old, 2 years old, did your parents sit you down or your older siblings sit you down and make you do, phonics and diagram sentences on a chalkboard or learn, vocabulary and how to? No, of course not. How do kids learn their native language? It's the subtle corrections that happen. It's the mimicking that we witness, innocently as it were. It's what we receive. And it's the not overt, not the kind of schooling or lecturing that others provide to us, but the subtle ways and subtle signals that form our kind of ability to think and process in the world. Yancey is making the point that white people inhabit a racialized community in which they become white through subtle, uncritical, and tacit socialization. At times, there are stronger signals sent to correct the, quote, racial grammar of white performance, but oftentimes it goes without saying. It usually happens in incredibly subtle ways. I can speak from my own experience. If you're in predominantly white company, the jokes that are said, the side remarks that are made, the way that people look or the way that things are described, all are forms of what Yancey calls this correcting the racial grammar. Because we white people have been formed to think of ourselves and our experience as normative, it can be very difficult for us to see the truth. This is not the case for people of color who are continuously confronted with the messages, and both subtle and explicit, that because they are not identified as white, they are not, quote, normal, that they are different, that they are other, that they are, as is euphemistically used sometimes in our society, that they are, quote, ethnic. I can tell you a personal story that I write about in my recent book about a Peruvian classmate of mine who made these jokes about how I was not ethnic. And there's more to say about that. But his point was a play on how race operates in our society and how whiteness is dominant. This is something that the scholar and early civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois understood personally and academically when, in 1903, he described the presence of the double consciousness that Black people experience when confronted with the structural, institutional, and historical realities of American racism and white normativity. He writes, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, This sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder, end quote. In a 1963 address to school teachers, the writer James Baldwin talked about how Black children recognize this dynamic of white normativity from the earliest age. He says, "There is something else the Negro child can do too. Every street boy, and I was a street boy, so I know, looking at the society which has produced him, looking at the standards of that society which are not honored by anybody, looking at your churches and the governments and the politicians, understands that this structure is operated for someone else's benefit, not for his. And there's no room in it for him." End quote. This sense of whiteness, meaning universal belonging or entitlement, is something that I've come to see with greater clarity over time, and has helped me to reckon with the fact that we live in a white supremacist culture, which presumes that my whiteness is the norm and those who look different from me are the exception or the other. Living in a racist society not only champions those aspects of my own cultural formation and worldview, my own senses of beauty, my own forms of comfort, but also makes clear that anything that does not reflect or conform to those standard norms is viewed or should be viewed and be treated as inferior or even worthless. Scholars like the sociologist Joe Fegan has described this phenomenon as the white racial frame. Fegan explains that the white racial frame is the dominant racial frame that has long legitimated, rationalized, motivated, and shaped racial oppression and inequality in this country. This white racial frame is a centuries-old worldview that has constantly involved a racial construction of social reality by white Americans, end quote. This is part of what it means when we talk about white privilege, namely that to be white in America is to be typically unaffected in any negative way from the hegemonic presence of whiteness as the social and cultural norm in nearly all aspects of shared common life. Whiteness is property. In 1993, the legal scholar Cheryl Harris published an important article in the Harvard Law Review in which she coined the phrase whiteness as property. Harris painstakingly demonstrates how the legal system in the US, from its very founding, established whiteness not only as a racial characteristic that distinguishes some people from others in an arbitrary manner, but also as a, quote, traditional form of property that bestowed on individuals categorized as white certain rights and privileges. Furthermore, these advantages were identified with the white individual such that they were always present as the personal property of that individual. In other words, if you're identified as white in a white racist society, you have that property and you carry it with you. It's non-transferable. Harris goes on to explain, she says, whiteness defined the legal status of a person as slave or free. White identity conferred tangible and economically valuable benefits, and it was jealously guarded as a valued possession, allowed only to those who met a strict standard of proof. Whiteness, she continues writing, the right to white identity as embraced by the law is property if by property one means all of a person's legal rights. Now there's a lot more to say, but I want to finish up so we can have some discussion. I'm tempted to go off script, but I'll hold on. Like other kinds of property, whiteness accrues value over a lifetime. This is another way to refer to the reality, again, of white privilege. As I mentioned earlier, the term can be somewhat misleading in that a common sense understanding of privilege would seem to suggest that white people should be able to recognize some concrete material benefits, or at least not experience, for example, fiscal hardship. But life, particularly in a racist society such as ours, is neither that simple nor that easy. We are more than just our race. As I mentioned earlier, we're also gendered and abled and intellectually variant and have a range of financial resources. This realization that identity and social context is the result of multiple complex social and power disparities requires a form of analysis, sometimes called intersectionality, because to understand a particular person's circumstances and social location requires analysis of all the intersecting social structures and dynamics that shape their experiences of the world. That said, within a racist society such as ours, one's perceived race plays a disproportionate role. One only has to think of examples like that of former President Barack Obama or Harvard history professor Henry Louis Gates Jr., both of whom are incredibly successful and intelligent and powerful men, and yet both have experienced discrimination and racist vitriol because they are also Black men. Conversely, even the poorest, the least educated, and otherwise socially disadvantaged white man will never have to endure the subtlest racist discrimination on a structural level, to be sure, or the most overt racial animus on account of his whiteness. The concept of whiteness as property articulates the material benefits that are collectively accrued to those identified as white in the United States. One of the obvious impacts of this phenomenon arising from whiteness considered supreme is the foreclosure of comparable benefits to those who are not identified as white. Over time, this results in generational material inequality, as well as the persistence of generational trauma. So in closing, I want to tie what I've presented to the theme of this series, namely addressing the soul sickness of racism. Expressed in this way, drawing from the description of the Fordham ethicist Father Brian Massengale, who coined the term soul sickness several years ago, this three-part lecture series was launched with the recognition that racism is more than just an individual, social, or institutional problem. Racism and its complement of white privilege are wisely likened to a spiritual illness. In discussing some of the impacts of whiteness, I hope to have highlighted some of the ways in which what is often experienced as invisible or not immediately consequential for those identified as white actually contributes to the great harm and oppression of people of color. In the Catholic tradition, there's a way to understand our sinful culpability beyond just discrete and deliberate actions. We call this sins of omission, or the failure to do what we ought to do. For many white people, the impacts of whiteness, especially the harmful consequences for people of color, are indeed instances of sins of omission, a failure to see clearly, to understand intentionally, to accept reality for what it is in all its unpleasant historical and contemporary truth, and then to do something about it. Likewise, in the Catholic tradition, we understand one's life journey as ongoing and akin to a pilgrimage. We are called to an ongoing and ever enduring experience of conversion and growth, which is one way to say it's never too late. My invitation to fellow white folks like me is fivefold, and this will be brief, I promise. And I am preaching to myself as much as I'm preaching to others. Let us not seek to preserve our racialized comfort over the discomforting facts of racial injustice that beckon our response. That's the simplest way to distill what's going on in our legislatures across the US right now. A preservation of our racialized comfort, not wanting to feel uncomfortable, not wanting to face reality. Let us avoid defensiveness and the temptation to dismiss, minimize, or erase the real suffering experienced by those harmed by systemic racism. Let us recognize the impacts of whiteness taken as normative and call out, reject, and seek to dismantle such cultural and societal hegemony. Let us open our eyes and ears and hearts to acknowledge that whiteness is a constructed racial identity that has tremendous impacts in our society and institutions, rather than close ourselves off to allow for continued invisibility. And let us work to dismantle the proprietary character of whiteness in our contexts so that greater equity, justice, and peace may abound. Education and awareness are just the beginning. And I'm grateful for all of you who are participating in our 3-week series, because this is part of why we're doing this, education and awareness. But response and action are what must follow. And I believe that is where Dr. Regina Hill will pick up next week when she addresses the theme, an anti-racist approach to allyship. So I thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Horan. That was amazing. I was there taking a lot of notes. thinking about how I'm going to shape my presentation for next week. So shameless plug, be back with us next week, same time, same place. I wish you would have went off subject. And I know we already did our Q&A. If you haven't seen that on YouTube, we did my Super Soul Sunday, I call it. And I've already interviewed you, but I wish you would have went off subject a little bit when you were talking about Cheryl Harris' article, because when I read it, it was so striking and moving for me as a Black woman, hearing her grandmother's experience and talking about whiteness as property. If you could talk a little bit more, because we have time, talk a little bit more about that. And then for those of you that have questions in the audience, raise your hands. If you have questions in the chat, put those in the chat. You can put it in the Q&A box or just put it in the chat.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hill. Just briefly, I'll say that, and I talk about this in my book, and we may have talked about it in, back in the fall when we had that conversation. I think Professor Harris's insight is deeply profound, and it's one of the most compelling ways to think about how race and whiteness in particular function in the United States. And I think something that Shannon Sullivan has in her own work, she's a white philosopher who does a lot of work on racism, race, critical whiteness, critical race theory. And she and others, particularly as we see right now with this legislative push, that there's always already a kind of legal and a shadow legal reality. And if we think about just what's officially in the books enshrined in law, that's insufficient. But the whiteness as property is the way that I thought about it most clearly for myself is the way that it's an asset that is non-fungible. I can't give it away. I can't trade it. I'm in a sense stuck with it because I'm shaped by the conditions around me. But there are real, actual, tangible results that arise from me being identified as white in this country. So the example that comes to mind, and this came in great relief, stark relief, I should say, with the murder of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia when he was out for a run. I'm a runner. That's an experience that I love. It really hit me. I mean, every time I hear of the death of somebody in a setting like this, particularly unarmed people of color at the hands of law enforcement, it's obviously tragic. It's obviously heartbreaking. But Arbery's case was one that struck me in a particular way that revealed to me how true this whiteness as property is, because I am somebody who've been blessed to travel around the world, around the country. I've given lots of talks and led workshops and retreats and studied and visited lots of places. And I have never felt, I may have been a little uncomfortable or unfamiliar with places, but my whiteness in retrospect is a property that has provided returns on, it's weird to say like investment, but returns on that property, which has been invested in me by a white supremacist society, so that I'm shielded from threats. I'm shielded from discomfort. I'm shielded from the realities that other people have. And Cheryl Harris talks about, a family member who presents as white and could pass in certain settings and what that means. And it means a whole lot in different contexts and different historical eras. There's a lot more to say about that. One of the things that was coming to mind that I was going to go off script about, and that I remembered I'm going to highlight it in passing, is the most powerful person in the world, two-term President Barack Obama. He is as much white biologically as he is Black, a white mother, Black father. And yet, because of the way that whiteness functions in a white supremacist society, he was only ever Black. And I think, he did not benefit, even as the most powerful person in the world, Nobel laureate, two-term president, does not benefit from that whiteness. And, just for me, highlights, regardless of your political position, just the reality of racialization in a white supremacist society. So I want to hear other questions and comments, but thank you for that invitation.
A few questions and comments online. If folks here in the room want to interject at any point, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. One incredible comment is from one of our viewers who was a student of Cheryl Harris and is just attesting to her impact, awesome. Which is so cool. One question here comes from Terry, who is asking, do most white people believe they are privileged? Wonder if you can comment on that, maybe based on your experience of talking about these or this literature you're citing.
Yeah, purely my sort of anecdotal and observational assessment. No, I think most white people really struggle with that, with the qualifier privilege or with the category privilege, which is what led me. And I don't mean to peddle this as the answer. I don't know that it's the answer for anything other than offering yet another oblique way to think about the phenomenon that white privilege describes, that I think Professor Harris also describes when she names whiteness as property. There are other ways we can kind of approach this reality. Privilege is a major hurdle for a lot of white people because of intersecting or buffeting realities that people have. So, it's hard to tell a rural, lower class, financially poor, uneducated white person in the United States that they're privileged. Oftentimes they say, well, where's my privilege? Where is this? The other thing that also that happens frequently with white people when white privilege comes up and there's this defensiveness or white fragility that leads to white rage, as Carol Anderson describes it, is the kind of exception that proves the rule. People will point to people like President Obama or somebody, or we mentioned Soul Sundays, Oprah Winfrey, she's a billionaire, obviously racism is over. Are you kidding me? But folks will use those exceptions. White folks will use those exceptions to kind of mitigate the hard truth. So here's where I stand, since I'll respond to that. I have come to believe that I have no problem, and those, if you're interested in reading my column that came out yesterday in National Catholic Reporter, I talk about this. I personally have no problem with the phrase white privilege. It's only because I've come to realize in time, personally, for me, Dan Horan, other ways in which I'm privileged. I'm a white person in the United States. I was born in this country. I'm a native English speaker, which as I travel around the world is more and more a privilege because that is now the universal language increasingly in this world. I am a cisgendered person. I identify with the biological sex I was assigned at birth. I am a Roman Catholic cleric. I'm a priest. That's a lot of privilege in church circles. I'm an incredibly educated person, if you haven't figured that out yet from Dr. Hill's very kind introduction. And much like all the folks who are students at St. Mary's or at Notre Dame or at Holy Cross, our education provides us with a lot of resources and privilege. And I could go on and on and on. And so when I recognize that my whiteness affects the way I move in the world and are perceived in the world, and that I experience it differently than those who don't benefit from that identity, that makes sense to me. But I've also become more and more aware, and this is where it gets tricky. It's an ongoing, I think, conversation a lot of folks are having right now, myself included, which is on the one hand, not succumbing to white comfort. I don't think it's okay that, white people don't like the term privilege, so we should just throw it out and find something that's more appealing, not to make light of it, but as seriously a concern. It's like euphemisms like you saw in the Second Iraq War, where you have enhanced interrogation techniques when you really mean torture. So we can call it whatever we want, but what is it actually that we're talking about? That's what I'm most interested in. So things like the snowplow, which I introduced, I think Professor Sullivan talks about white priority. I didn't even talk about that much in my talk, but her point is like, who gets priority? Who gets preference? Whose value, who is valued more, and we could go on. So there are other ways to think about it, but the short answer is no. I think privilege is a stumbling block for a lot of white people. And I think my invitation is for my fellow white folks is to not get defensive and to push through the discomfort, to listen to and to understand what it is we're talking about.
Great questions from online, one of which I think follows nicely on this last point you made about white priority. Someone's asking how we should approach the work of addressing white privilege and white supremacy, thinking in a religious group that is predominantly white, though also has Latina and Asian women. How to do that while respecting the Latina and Asian women is the question being raised.
Yeah, that is a really important question. And because I've talked about, in my presentation, how racialization in the US context is oftentimes binary. And it's usually reduced, especially since the prevalence of anti-Black racism in the US. And that is no accident when you go all the way back to 1619 onward, that it's not wrong to talk about it that way. However, the binary is not actually white and black. The binary is like white and not white. And then in the not white category, and this is where I think, the Pulitzer Prize journalist and author Isabel Wilkerson's invitation for us to consider as a metaphor caste, and her book Caste, The Source of America's Discontent or something like this, or subtitle, is an excellent book. I know not everybody finds that compelling. I think she makes a really good point where caste is about a racial hierarchy, and that in the United States, it's not just white and black. How do you make sense then of anti-Asian discrimination or anti-Latinx discrimination or what have you, in all racial groupings? And she makes this point that there's actually a spectrum, there's a range. And I think thinking about that metaphor of caste is really helpful. It's helped me, and I think that's what I would suggest to.
For the sake of time, I'll just drop one more question out for you. The question is, what has blossomed in your learning of racial justice work that keeps you wanting to be engaged in this work, especially when there is a majority of people who don't want to give up their power or see what you are doing as counterproductive or just rocking the boat?
I don't know. If I'm being honest, I really don't know. Folks who know me know that, I always like to ask folks, especially when I'm leading a retreat or in teaching a class, if we're talking about the Hebrew prophets in the Jewish and Christian scriptures, I always like to ask, what's your favorite prophet? It's always a good conversation starter because most people have never been asked that before. And there are these 12 minor prophets and the big ones like Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Moses and John the Baptist and what have you. Well, Jeremiah is somebody who's always appealed to me. And part of it is because all prophets in scripture are reluctant to take up the call that God is inviting them to. The call is always about justice and peace. The call is always about reconciliation and living rightly according to God's covenant. What I like about Jeremiah is you get the whole kind of picture of the story from the very beginning when he tries to wiggle out of it. He doesn't quite understand what's going on. God says to him, trust me, I will be there with you. I will tell you what you need to do. And then famously, if you fast forward 20 chapters, you get this scene that a lot of people know about where, Jeremiah is crying out to God, you tricked me, you duped me, Lord, I let myself be duped. And he has this sort of self-reflection, this soliloquy where he says, if I just shut up, people will stop bothering me. People will stop trolling me. People will stop hating me. People will want to associate with me again. Maybe I can find my friends again. I won't be hated or despised. And then he says, I can't shut up because your word, O Lord, is like a fire within me. It's an unquenchable fire. And I'm not claiming to be like Jeremiah. I'm just saying that inexplicability where he knows his life would be a whole lot easier, is as the questioner put it, rocking the boat, if he didn't rock the boat. And I think last week's presentation where Dr. Heller presented a lot of particularly Black women in the United States who rocked the boat for the sake of justice. It would be a lot easier for Rosa Parks and everybody else to not rock the boat. And yet, is that not, I don't know. I think the way I think about it sometimes is you can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unknow what you've learned. The question is, what are you going to do about it? And I have a lot to learn. I have a lot more to see. I have a lot to change. I have a lot of work to do. And it's my hope, I'll give two things because I know Dr. Hill's ready to land the plane of our presentation here. But one is that Francis of Assisi, I'm a Franciscan friar, and Francis of Assisi famously said near the end of his life that the Lord had shown him what is his to do. May the Lord show you what is yours. In other words, that God doesn't make sort of one size fits all vocations. And I've always loved that. And how I understand it in this case is like, I don't know what everybody else's role is, but I feel for some inexplicable reason very convicted that part of what I'm called to do, at least at this moment in time, is to speak to other white folks like me. I'm not the only one to do it. I'm not the first person to do it. And God willing, I won't be the last. But that's where I feel, to the questioner's phrasing, the kind of blossoming of this awareness, where it's less of blossoming sounds nice. It's more of like a Jeremiah kind of fire that I sometimes wish was not there. But I want to close. I don't want to have the last word. And I think I have the opportunity to do another shout out to Claudia Rankin, the poet and playwright. In what year did this come out? 2014. She had a book of prose poetry called Citizen, an American Lyric, that went on to win several awards. It's a very, very powerful book. I highly recommend it. It's organized into several parts, and in some of the parts, they're not exactly chapters. Some of the sections, there are just these kind of one-page stories, narratives, anecdotes, little vignettes. And there's one that haunts me every time I read it, and I want to share it because it's a reminder to me of just how insidious racism and white supremacy is in this country, and that even those who are white people in particular, who are anti-racist activists, who are not afraid of the discomfort of the hard truths, we can still trip up. We can still be sort of sold out by our white racism. And so she tells this is the story. I'm just going to read it as is, and I'm going to let that be the last word. The new therapist specializes in trauma counseling. You have only ever spoken on the phone. Her house has a side gate that leads to a back entrance she uses for patients. You walk down a path bordered on both sides with deer grass and rosemary to the gate, which turns out to be locked. At the front door, the bell is a small round disc that you press firmly. When the door finally opens, the woman standing there yells at the top of her lungs, "Get away from my house! What are you doing in my yard?" It's as if a wounded Doberman Pinscher or a German Shepherd has gained the power of speech. And though you back up a few steps, you manage to tell her you have an appointment. You have an appointment? She spits back. Then she pauses. Everything pauses. "Oh," she says, followed by, "Oh, yes, that's right. I am sorry. I am so sorry. So sorry."
That was a mic drop moment, so I just waited off to the side to let it simmer a little bit. Thank you so much, Dr. Dan Horan. I'm so grateful for being a partner with you in not only this series, but in the line of work that we do. So grateful for all of you that have tuned in online, for those of you that have showed up in person. Like I said earlier, we'll be back here next week, 5 o'clock, and I will be your presenter next week. So please show up. Thank you. Have a good night.